The male gaze upon women and the feminine has been well charted. Less explored is the gaze upon men and the masculine. A number of writers in the visual media, for example war photography, fine art, literature, and film studies, have noted that the naked and wounded, generally male body, is offered as spectacle and carries sexual gender meanings. But the focus has been principally upon the construction of masculinity, dynamics of the male gaze, and the possibilities for a female gaze. These questions are taken up, in different ways, in the chapters here by Viv Burr on Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Tim Edwards on masochism in the movies. Interestingly, the idea of the wound or the wounding of men has been taken up by a surprisingly diverse collection of mainly male writers in recent years, including Robert Bly, Father Wound, Victor Seidler, wounds from both hegemonic forms of men's identities and from feminism, and Michael Kaufman and Michael Kimmel, Mother Wound. They argue, in different ways, and with less or more sympathies with feminisms, that men are damaged, wounded, by gender arrangements or patriarchal relations in terms of their relations with men, women, mothers, fathers, self. Kaja Silverman, drawing on the work of Leo Bersani, has taken these critiques further, arguing for a subversive potential of masochistic wounding, through a fragmentation of the dominant male subject, focusing her attention on cultural products, notably films. Calvin Thomas, also developing Bersani, extends this approach both to the medium of writing and to what this means in social practice more generally, arguing that penetration of men is key for anti-patriarchal identity and social change. Film provides a rich set of traditions. According to Anek Smelik, in Hollywood, the denial of the homoeroticism of looking at images of men constantly involves sadomasochistic themes, scenes, and fantasies. The highly ritualized scenes of male struggle deflects the look away from the male body to the scene of the spectacular fight. Gangster films routinely deploy violent heterosex, with blood, guns, and weapons, added none too subtly, and often phallically, into the concoction. Horror and slasher genres threaten vampiric bitings and monstrous woundings on the purer, usually female, victims, with its own replications of horror virgins. Special film favorites among both the viewing public and eager analysts are Alien, Fatal Attraction, and The Silence of the Lambs, and indeed their sequels, such as Red Dragon and Hannibal Rising, with sex, violence, and wounding, actual, threatened, imagined, never far from the scene. The names of Peckinpah and Tarantino have become almost synonymous with the power of wounding. Michael Hanek's films, such as Funny Games, The Piano Teacher, and Funny Games US, also explore sex, violence, and S&M. The film Crash, the subject of Anthony McCosker's chapter, is iconic of the erotics of wounding in the relations of body and technology. Some of these representations thrive on intertextualities, multiple links between sex, as an alien divine force within the body, violence, and religion, have been charted in film genres. In this view, divine eros is always other, God is infinitely alien, yet intimate to ourselves, a sacred eroticism. And in a different approach crossing social practice and representation, Stephen Eisenman has shown the meaningful links between images from paintings of the Grand Masters and photographic images from Abu Ghraib. Meanwhile, contemporary mainstream television, inter alia, Dexter, Grey's Anatomy, House, Nip Tuck, seems to delight in broadcasting wounds nonchalantly. Similar themes have also been taken up in various forms of body art and performance art. In recent years, there has been a pronounced tendency for some artists to use their own bodies as a medium for their art. In some cases, body art has been linked to feminist politics or clear gender themes, as in the works of Matthew Barney, Helen Chadwick, Sarah Lucas, Nan Golden, and Carolee Schneemann. In others, different personal and political projects are emphasized, sometimes with nihilistic or negativistic aspects. Either way, the artist's model is the artist's body itself. In Extreme Bodies, the Use and Abuse of the Body in Art, Francesca Alfano Miglietti builds on multiple examples from both classical and contemporary art to discuss about wounds. She reviews the works of the photographer Rudolf Schwarzkogler, who inflicted wounding and mutilation, including symbolic castration, on himself, Gina Payne, who, through photography and film, used burning, cutting, and thorns to link religious iconography and the exhibiting cut exposures of her body, and Franco B., who also used his body and blood in his performance art to overcome the separation of reality and representation. This is the arena explored by Ulla Angerkager Jorgensen in her chapter, Cut Pieces, Self-Mutilation in Body Art. Her chapter illustrates the need to think across practice representation. In this practice is representation, and vice versa. Wounds and wounding can carry multiple symbolic sexual meanings. Wounds wound flesh, human meat, which itself may sometimes become a sexual fetish. Cuts and cutting may signify loss. The erotic may be assumed to arise in gaps, overlaps, contrasts, ambiguities between other elements that are split as signs. The arrows afflicting Saint Sebastian may be phallic, or the slashing wound itself. The slashed wound may be the vaginal or anal slit, or again phallic. The blood may be menstrual, anal, or seminal. The wound and wounding in representation is that extra notch of violence that may seem much more violent than the physical attack with fists or head or feet or even weapons that brings heavy bruising or internal bleeding. It is, or pretends to be, the peak visual experience, the breaking of the skin membrane container and the letting out of flesh and blood within, perhaps equivalent to the pornographic money shot. There are also many art house examples, most famously Louis Bonnel and Salvador Dali's iconic cutting of the eye in Chien Andalou. Theoretical, ethical, and political issues. Thinking about sex and violence in wounding and embodied contexts raises many methodological and theoretical questions. Though our prime concern here is exploration rather than explanation, we might consider how to explain wounding as an individual, interpersonal, group, cultural, societal, or transsocietal phenomenon. The answer to such questions must of course depend on the specific forms of violence being addressed. Some examples of wounding are mass market, as in cosmetic surgery. Others are more minority pursuits, such as ritual group S&M. Different practices are more or less readily understandable in relation to historical processes of capitalist marketization of the body, heteropatriarchal gender power relations, imperialist and post-colonial ethnic othering, and other structural power relations. Even so, the nature of the relationship between wounding and eroticism is often taken for granted. Where it has been given more focused attention, for example, Silverman 1992, its theoretical analysis has been largely limited to a psychodynamic framework. Perhaps significantly, and despite their critiques, psychoanalytic approaches sometimes seem hard to avoid totally in discussing these matters, not least through the return to the relations of sex and death. Thinking about sex, violence, the body, and wounding is instructive for thinking and acting on general methodological and epistemological concerns, for example, the relations of materiality and discourse. Theoretical, and sometimes abstracted, debates on relations of the material and the discursive, the macro and the micro, and structure and agency, become especially important as the context of research and intervention on these embodied matters. They point to the significance of diverse theoretical traditions, including feminism, materialism, structuralism, post-structuralism, and social constructionism, deconstruction, as well as psychoanalytics. Violence and wounding are both simultaneously material and discursive, simultaneously painful, full of pain, and textual, full of text. They are matters of experience of change in bodily matter, and matters of change in discursive constructions. Wounding, and what is meant by wounding, is historically, socially, and culturally constructed. This is a matter of material discourse. Talk and text about wounding is not just representation, it is also creation of reality in its own right. The whole complex of wounding, talk about wounding, and responses thereto is a cultural phenomenon that is both material and discursive. In this complex theoretical universe, it might be appropriate to talk of post-structuralism in emphasizing materiality and bodily effects, especially of sexually violent acts and sexually violent words. There are possible misuses of discourse and deconstruction in addressing wounding. They may divert attention from the body and the bodily materiality of violence, even if viewing the body as materialization of discourse. There are certainly problems with apolitical uses of deconstruction, whether through confusion with destruction or engulfment within the pleasure of the text. Deconstruction does not delete ethico-political concerns. As with the reappropriation, even revalidation, of the abject in wounding chic. In all this, it is important to remember that a key focus of this work on wounding is on violence. As such, being against wounding in real life, that is, wounding as violence, is part of stopping violence. At the same time, wounding, and thus its erotics, remains a broad concept. In some definitions, it might range from, for example, unwanted splitting of skin in consensual anal penetration to fatal wounding in sexual crime. Thus, the erotics of wounding raise many ethico-political concerns, contingent partly on what is being meant by wounding and partly on different ethical and political positions and standpoints. This is no more clear than in the contested arena of S&M sexual practice, especially more violent forms of S&M. One major issue is the status of consent in such contexts. There is much room for disagreements among commentators here. For some, adults are able to announce their own consent unqualified and be beyond critique. For others, announced consent is no different from other social constructions within sexual, gendered, and other power relations, including constructions of consent within gender hegemony. A crucial question remains: the gendered, sexual, violent relations of talk, text on wounding, and actions on wounding and the body. This is not to suggest that there is any fixed set of relations, but these questions do seem especially persistent in critically studying men and masculinities, where close relations of sexuality and violence often seem to inhabit the same bodies, times, and places. Such gendered, sexual, violent relations also intersect with other social divisions and constructions of erotics of wounding. Significantly, recent decades have seen important moves from dramatic or art uses of wounding, or wounding as a minority representational practice, to the mass reproduction of such images in mass market media. Rapid changes in modes of cultural reproduction, with virtuality, replication, and construction of persons, have coupled with processes of pornographization. A recent mainstream magazine advertisement for Diesel clothing featured a topless man with whip marks on his back in the shape of a game of noughts and crosses. In this case of wounding chic, the complaint against it was upheld by the UK Advertising Standards Authority. This book necessarily brings together a range of issues around sexuality, gender, power, violence, and representations. It straddles several disciplinary areas: cultural and media studies, sociology, psychology, social psychology, as well as studies on gender, sexuality, and violence. It brings together contributions from Australia, Finland, Norway, Sweden, and the UK on both social practices and representations in film and other media. This book acts on long-running preoccupations with the relations of sex and violence and seeks to contribute to general debates on the relationship between sexuality, violence, and gender, as well as on more focused concerns. The cultural significance of the erotics of wounding has implications for sexuality, violence, and gender more generally. The variety of the relations between wounding and sexuality is a key focus of this book. Following this introduction, the next 5 chapters address social sites where real bodily wounding and injury may take place. These examine body mutilation and cosmetic surgery, domestic violence and bodily marking, S&M and self-injury, extreme sports and risk. The next 4 chapters are more concerned with specific forms and examples of representation, focusing on the David Cronenberg film Crash, fan fiction, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and men in the movies. While in some senses all the chapters deal with the interrelations of the real and the representational, this complex matter of the crossover between the real and the representational is highlighted in the last 2 chapters. These chapters are thus on performance art, using the body as an art resource through injury, and researchers and journalists writing on rape, violence, and wounding.